Hello, darlin', it's me, sweet Ruth Ellen McCaskill, sitting here in my old rocker on the front porch, the same one I've rocked in for nearly 50 years. I can still smell that first cup of black coffee steaming in this chipped mug, mingling with the faint scent of honeysuckle drifting in from the garden. This soft, golden morning light, like an old photograph come to life, woke a memory that's been sleeping in my heart all these years. It feels like just yesterday I was 14, with Mama's lullaby fading behind me and Reverend Elroy's shadow filling my world. I can almost taste the sweetness of that June breeze, heavy with the promise of summer storms. Back in 1965, at about 20 minutes past sunrise, Mama took her last breath, bringing my baby brother into the world. I was just a child, clutching the edge of her bed, feeling the floor tilt beneath my feet. Papa was nowhere to be found. He'd been drinking since dawn, and the church folk all stared at me with worried eyes. Reverend Thomas Elroy, twice my age, gray at the temples, widowed with 2 little ones of his own, stepped forward and said God had laid it on his heart to take me in, to spare me from the state's cold hands. Better a godly man's care than the world's harsh machines, they whispered. So I left my childhood home, that little clapboard house where every floorboard creaked under memories, and walked into a life I never chose. I remember the hush of that long car ride, the hum of the engine, the soft click of my heart beating too fast. Reverend Elroy drove with gloved hands on the wheel, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. I wore the pale blue dress Mama had mended for me last Easter, now faded and frayed at the hem. "You'll be safe with me, child," he said, voice steady as a hymn. And I believed him. I believed every word. Now I'm 72, and this story still lingers in my soul like a hymn I can't forget. It isn't bitter, exactly, not all the time. There's warmth in remembering that a man took pity on a frightened girl, gave me a bed, and taught me the Bible every morning. But there's a darkness, too, a weight pressed against my chest whenever I recall how his hand lingered too long at my waist, how he called me his wife when the world was watching, though I wasn't his by any right. I never called him my husband. In my mind he was always Reverend Elroy, respectful on the surface, heavy-handed underneath. Perhaps it's the gentle patter of rain on the tin roof, or the way these old chairs creak just so, as if echoing my own bones, that brings this memory back. Or maybe it's knowing so many young souls still look for refuge in any promise of safety and don't see the chains until it's too late. I feel this stirring in my chest, equal parts longing and warning, like my heart still beats for that scared girl, waiting for someone to say, "It's going to be all right," while also shouting, "Run, child, run." Here we are on this bright morning in Dothan, Alabama, me sharing what's been tucked away for 6 decades. There's more to this tale than pity or scandal. There's forgiveness, reckoning, and a truth that set me free. Next, I'll tell you how a church pew became both my sanctuary and my cage. I want you to picture a little white farmhouse tucked just outside Dothan, Alabama, its paint peeling soft as peach fuzz, the screen door creaking every time the summer breeze picked at it. That was home to me until I was 14, a tiny world of cotton fields swaying under a pale sun, cicadas humming their evening songs, and my mama's roses, pink and proud, blooming wild along the fence. Back then, I believed kindness was the truest currency in life, that folks would always come back round to repay a good deed. Morning light would slip through the gingham curtains and find me tiptoeing into the kitchen, where Mama's cast-iron skillet hissed with bacon grease and fresh biscuits steamed on the windowsill. My papa was a gentle man most days, though he wrestled shadows in his heart he'd never show me. We'd eat breakfast on the sagging porch steps, Mama humming an old hymn as she buttered bread, and I'd daydream about the wide world beyond our dirt road, convinced I'd become a schoolteacher someday, teach little ones how to read and write, maybe sing them a lullaby of my own. Weekdays meant church pews and hymnals, where Reverend Elroy, tall and stern, with a voice that rolled like distant thunder, lectured about God's love and mercy. I wore my best Sunday dress, hemmed by Mama's careful hands, and held my brother's hand tight as we knelt on the cool wooden slats. I thought then that this was the most sacred place on earth, where prayers rose like whispered seeds, drifting up to heaven. On Saturdays, Papa hitched the mule to the plow and I followed him into the fields, the earth cool beneath my bare feet, the sky so vast it made me dizzy with wonder. After the day's work, we'd gather creek water in galvanized buckets and splash through the shallows, hunting tadpoles with giggles and squeals. In those moments I drifted into dreams of running barefoot across endless pastures, of finding a place where no one ever cried or got hurt. Evenings were made for stories. I'd prop my elbows on the porch railing, chin in my hands, while Mama recounted tales of her own childhood in those same fields, secret picnics under magnolia trees, starlit skies, fireflies dancing like tiny lanterns. She'd sigh, "Child, the world's full of both heartbreak and hope. You just gotta carry the light." Her eyes glimmered with truth, and I believed her. Love felt like a sunset back then, full of promise, painting the sky with swirls of pink and gold, always returning, even if you slept through it. I was a quiet girl, shy around other children, preferring Mama's kitchen apron to a playground swing. I scribbled my dreams in a little leather-bound journal, stories of far-off places, laughter that never ended, hands reaching out in kindness. I imagined a life where I chose my path, where tragedy and loss didn't define me, but the warmth I carried in my heart did. When the church bells chimed on Sunday mornings, I believed God Himself was calling me into something grand and holy. Little did I know those footsteps I followed so faithfully would one day lead me down a road I could never have imagined. Here in this quiet morning light, I travel back to that child's world, where honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass still linger, and every memory feels as soft as satin. I want you to feel it too, the innocence, the gentle rhythm of our days, the way hope and sorrow sat side by side on that old porch. In that tender beginning lies the seed of everything that followed, the joy, the heartbreak, and the truths I had yet to learn. Sweet heavens, I remember it like a summer storm when Reverend Thomas Elroy stepped into my life and turned everything upside down. I stood by Mama's graveside, clutching that faded handkerchief she'd pressed into my trembling fingers while the earth still held the day's warmth. Papa slumped against the old oak fence, pale as a ghost, and my little brother was too young to know why Mama's lullabies would never come again. The congregation gathered in solemn rows, faces full of worried kindness, when I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder and heard a voice that rumbled low, like distant thunder. "Child," he said, tipping his wide-brimmed hat, "you're not meant to walk this road alone." My heart, which had felt too heavy to beat, skipped a frantic rhythm I couldn't explain. The reverend was a tall man of 42 by the town's reckonings, his silver hair gleaming in the sunshine and his black suit as crisp as a Sunday hymn. He carried 2 worn leather-bound Bibles under one arm and crouched to meet my eyes, offering the gentlest smile I'd ever seen on someone with such stern shoulders. I thought, who is this stranger who knows my name? They said he'd been widowed years before, left to raise 2 small children alone, pouring every ounce of love into his pulpit and his flock. No one had ever looked at me with such intention, as if he saw into the hollow spaces my grief had carved. "Mama loved you fiercely," he murmured, "and she'd want you cared for now." I blinked away tears, wondering why his words felt like both a balm and a blade. Neighbors whispered blessings all around. Mrs. Carter dabbed at her eyes. Mr. Jenkins lifted his hat, and my schoolteacher, Miss Lorraine, gave me a timid nod, afraid to step too close to such a tender moment. But it was Reverend Elroy who reached out, took my hand in a steady one, and led me away from the grave and the pain I thought would swallow me whole. In that instant, The world narrowed to the beat of my chest, the faint perfume of lilies drifting on the breeze, and the congregation's murmured prayers fading behind us. I trusted this man who'd barely spoken 2 sentences more than the ground beneath my dusty shoes. He led me to his black sedan parked by the church steps, its paint gleaming in the sun. I hesitated, glancing back at my broken family and the only home I'd ever known, and he met my gaze and said, "Come on now, sweet Ruth. Let me keep you safe." I climbed in, feeling the leather seat cool against my dress and the engine purr like a lullaby of new beginnings. Reverend Elroy drove us away from the cemetery, the church spire shrinking in my rearview mirror, and for the first time in days, I breathed without sorrow pressing on my ribs. In the passenger seat, I looked at the man beside me, so different from the scared soldiers I'd seen sob into hymnals, and felt a spark of anticipation, as if my life was about to unfold in ways I couldn't imagine. That moment, his hand in mine and the horizon stretching before us, marked the end of my childhood and the start of a path I never chose, but would walk for many years to come. It was the spark that lit a fire in my soul, blending awe, fear, and a longing for something safe to hold. Though I couldn't see it then, that choice shaped every chapter of my life, from the fields of my youth to the quiet front porch where I sit today, still feeling the echo of that first, fateful ride in Reverend Elroy's car. That first week in the parsonage felt like stepping into a gilded cage. One morning, I woke before dawn to the chime of the church bell, even though services weren't until Sunday, and found the Reverend standing at my bedside, Bible in hand, reminding me that a godly life begins with discipline. I gulped down lukewarm porridge at the kitchen table while Mrs. Harper bustled around me, her soft eyes full of pity. Outside the window, the world I'd known, Mama's roses, Papa's crooked fence, the dusty roads, seemed a lifetime away. Here, everything was ordered. Prayers at 6, chores at 7, study at 8, more chores at 10, lunch at noon, prayers at 1, sewing or lessons in the afternoon, and then, if I'd earned it, a few minutes alone on the back porch before supper. At first, I welcomed the routine. It felt safe and predictable, like I was finally honoring Mama's memory. But safety can be a trap. The whispers started the day I tried to write a letter home. "Children of the church remain here," the Reverend said, ripping my pen-stained paper in half. His voice was firm, and my heart thundered so hard I feared it would burst. He had turned my tears into a sermon about gratitude, and I couldn't find a single word of thanks in my throat. Shame settled in my chest like a stone. Rumors swirled in town. Folks whispered that sweet Ruth had grown too old for girlhood, that the Reverend's kindness hid darker intentions. I caught the tail end of conversations in the pews. "Isn't she just a child? He's a man of God, surely he wouldn't," and I felt eyes on me everywhere. Even Mrs. Carter, who once praised my manners, avoided my gaze. I tried to cling to memories of home, but they felt as distant as a dream at noon. Inside, my mind waged war. I longed to run back to that little white farmhouse, to hide in the rose bushes and pretend none of this had happened. Yet part of me believed I'd be in worse danger there, alone with Papa's sorrow and the state's cold system. I'd given my faith to the Reverend, and questioning him felt like betraying God himself. Every time I hesitated, he offered me a glass of lemonade on the porch and reminded me that my strength comes from obedience. His words felt like chains disguised as comfort. On the third evening after supper, he asked me to recite my Bible verses before the family. When I stumbled over a line from Proverbs, he placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, led me into the parlor, and locked the door. For the first time I saw the man behind the preacher's mask, eyes soft but unyielding, a quiet demand pulsing in his steady gaze. Fear and anger swirled inside me, and tears fell as I realized how utterly alone I was. He brushed a strand of hair from my brow and said, "It's for your own good, child." That night, I lay awake on my narrow cot, listening to the rain hissing against the window, wondering if obedience was really love or just another word for giving myself away. Somewhere in the darkness, Mrs. Harper knocked softly, slid a small loaf of bread and glass of milk beneath my door, and whispered that she was there if I needed her. Her kindness was a lifeline, but it also reminded me that no one else could fight this battle for me. My dilemma crystallized: trust the man everyone called Reverend, or trust the trembling voice inside me that insisted I deserved more than solitude and sermons. The parsonage walls closed in tighter each day, and my heart grew heavy with questions I dared not speak. Those first trials, as painful as they were, taught me the hardest lesson of all: danger often wears a gentle face, and courage begins with naming our own truths. I can still feel the weight of that afternoon settling over me like a winter quilt. The sun hung low in the sky, golden and heavy, as though it knew something vital had shattered. The church bell tolled, and in that moment everything went quiet in my world. Time stopped when Reverend Elroy asked me to join him in a study for a matter of importance. My heart fluttered like a trapped bird as I climbed the narrow staircase, each step thudding under my feet. The parlor door stood half open, light spilling onto the worn rug, and there he was, silhouetted against the window, his broad shoulders rigid, one hand resting on the polished desk. I swallowed the lump in my throat, wiped my trembling palms on my skirt, and stepped inside. He closed the door behind me with a soft click that felt like a guillotine falling. I froze, the air thick with unspoken words. For a moment, the distance between us felt impossible, as if I were watching from miles away. Then he spoke in that low, gentle rumble I used to trust. "Ruth, I need you to understand how much you mean to me." His words, meant to comfort, fell like stones in my chest. I realized with cold clarity that the man who'd vowed to protect me saw me not as a frightened child, but as something else entirely: an adult, his equal, his wife. My breath caught when he stepped closer, and my pulse pounded like a drum in my ears. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice cracked and died. His hand reached for mine, gentle at first, then firm, guiding it to rest just above his heart. His face softened, but it was the kind of softness that frightened me more than anger ever could. I saw the possessive look in his eyes, unwavering and absolute, and the world tilted on its axis. In that suspended moment I saw Mama kneeling at her bedside, weary eyes cradling my tears. I saw the little girl I'd been, the one who believed in simple kindness and Sunday hints. I felt the life I thought I'd surrendered to grace slip through my fingers like fine sand. Shock rippled through me. How could the man of God betray every promise he'd made, every prayer he'd taught me to speak? Dimly, I recognized that innocence was dying, and something fierce and hard was being born in its place. I pulled my hand away, voice trembling but fierce. "Reverend." The words tumbled into silence as he closed the gap between us, pressing a single, slow kiss to my forehead. His lips were cold. Tears stung my eyes as I sank to the floor, clutching my skirts, head bowed not in prayer but in despair. He knelt beside me, murmuring apologies as hollow as a broken hymn. In those agonizing seconds I understood what I had lost: the right to choose, the refuge I'd prayed for, the safety I believed faith would bring. Mercy, I saw, could be a guise for control. Trust could twist into bondage. Something inside me snapped, like a wildflower stem breaking under too much weight. I rose, each breath a declaration of the self I would no longer give away. Through tears I faced him, gathered my courage and whispered, "This isn't right." Then I turned and stumbled down the stairs, across the hall, into the world that resumed its rhythm all around me: the distant hum of voices, the tick of the grandfather clock, the summer breeze stirring the curtains. I was different from that moment on. A fracture had formed in my soul, and though I couldn't name it then, I knew my life would never be the same. From that day forward, I vowed to reclaim the girl I once was and become the woman I was meant to be. I slipped away from that study with trembling legs and a heart hollowed by betrayal, and for weeks I scarcely spoke a word. The parsonage felt suddenly vast and silent, every hallway echoing with the ghost of what I'd thought was refuge. I spent my mornings perched on the back steps, wrapped in a quilt Mama made, staring at the empty fields beyond the fence as if they might whisper the answers I needed. The world went on turning, church bells still rang, Mrs. Harper still polished the silver, the kitchen clock ticked its steady rhythm, but I was adrift in a sea of numbness, too weary to cling to the oars. I couldn't pray. Every time I lifted my hands in supplication, I saw the Reverend's face instead of the face of my Creator, and the words felt empty on my tongue. Food lost its flavor, and I wandered through meals as though moving through a dream, nodding at each solemn face in the dining room but unable to meet any gaze. My Bible lay unopened on my dresser, its pages yellowed with age and promise I no longer trusted. In the quiet moments, panic would rise in me, sharp as splintered glass, when the memory of that kiss on my forehead pressed against my skin like a cruel reminder. I'd press my palms to my ears to block out the echo of his whispers, "It's for your own good," but the echoes clung to me like shadows at dusk. I felt as though I'd lost not just my innocence, but the very foundation of myself, the faith I'd built on childhood hymns and Mama's soothing prayers. Days stretched into weeks, and I found myself wandering the grounds of the church after dark, my feet carrying me beyond the reach of the lamps, into the hush of the magnolia grove where fireflies danced like tiny lanterns. There, beneath the canopy of stars, I'd whisper the questions I could never voice in daylight. Why did I let him break the vows he preached? Where does a girl go when both her home and her sanctuary betray her? The warm night air offered no answers, but each breath in the dark felt like a small reclamation of life. I began to write again, first faltering lines in a tattered journal, then whole pages of memories I hadn't dared to speak. My words trembled on the page, raw with grief and anger, and a longing for the child I once was. No one in town noticed my transformation. To them, I was still sweet Ruth, the quiet girl with the soft heart. They continued to ask after my health, to compliment my composure, to speak of Reverend Elroy with respect and reverence. But I was a stranger even to myself. The mirror showed a gaunt woman with sad eyes and tight lips, eyes that no longer glimmered with Sunday morning hope. I realized I was living inside a question I couldn't answer, and the ache of that uncertainty settled deep in my bones. I threw myself into small acts of rebellion, lingering in bed past dawn, refusing to recite my verses, slipping out at dusk to walk the dusty road home, just to feel the rough earth beneath my heels. Over time, a quiet resolve took root in that emptiness. I began to patch that Bible's torn pages with bits of ribbon, not to restore its power, but to honor the memory of faith before it was shattered. I tended Mama's roses in the parsonage garden, coaxing new blooms from old vines, each petal a fragile testament to resilience. And when the weight of loneliness pressed too hard, I'd sing the lullabies Mama used to hum, letting the melody carry me back to childhood evenings on the porch. My voice was soft, unsteady at first, but with each note I felt a flicker of warmth return to my chest. I cannot say that I found my faith again in those days, but I discovered something just as precious, the mercy of my own shaking heart, the power to rebuild a self that neither sorrow nor betrayal could fully destroy. In the hush after the storm, I learned that loss leaves spaces for new life to grow, and that in the quiet, I could hear the faint stirrings of hope once more. You know, I never expected hope to find me again, but one crisp October afternoon, it crept in on little pink wings. I was sitting on that same back porch, the one where fireflies used to dance, reading through letters I'd begun writing to the girls at the women's shelter down the road. My hand ached from holding the pen so tight, and the words felt clumsy, but I kept writing anyway. because writing was the closest I could come to speaking my own truth out loud. As the sun dipped low behind the pines, I heard soft footsteps approaching, and there stood young Elsie, barely 17, clutching a battered suitcase and shaking like a leaf in the wind. I'd met her once at the shelter, bright eyes, a wild tangle of curls, and a story much like mine, a child who'd lost her way, seeking refuge in a place that promised safety but often felt as cold as steel. She didn't say a word at first, just folded herself onto the swing beside me, and I could feel the tremor of her sorrow. I set aside my pen and reached out, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Sweet girl," I whispered, "what brings you here tonight?" Her shoulders shook, and at last she nodded, voice soft as prayer. I ran away from home again. I thought maybe I'd find peace here." My heart twisted in that moment. How many times had I chased peace in pews and hallways, only to find the walls closing in tighter? But as I looked at Elsie's tear-stained face, I realized peace wasn't something you found in a building or a sermon. Peace was the gentle touch of a hand, the promise of understanding, the courage to let someone see your broken pieces and stay anyway. I lifted her chin and spoke the words I'd once lain beneath the stars to hear, "You are safe here with me." In saying it, I felt something shift inside my chest, a soft bloom of warmth where only emptiness had dwelt. That night, I made her a cup of hot chamomile tea, sweetened just so, and we sat on the porch swing under a shy sky of stars. I shared the story of Mama's roses, of her promise that even the hardest winters yield to spring's gentle thaw. I told her how I'd lost everything I thought defined me, my faith, my innocence, my place in the world, and how I'd spent years gathering the broken bits into something resembling hope. As I spoke, I watched Elsie's shoulders relax, her fingers uncurl around that suitcase handle. The next morning I rose before dawn and wrote my first note of volunteer duty. "I'll come by every Tuesday afternoon to sit with whoever needs an ear or a porch swing." I walked to the shelter in my old lace-up shoes, carrying a basket of homemade biscuits and that battered journal where I'd tucked scraps of hard-won wisdom. When I stepped inside, the hall fell silent, and I felt eyes shift, curious, wary, hopeful. But I didn't mind. I found Elsie in the corner, tracing the grain of a wooden chair with a penknife, and I sat beside her, offering a biscuit as though it were the sweetest manna from heaven. She took it with a small half-smile, and I felt a spark of something bright flicker in that dusty room. In the weeks that followed, I made that walk every Tuesday, and soon it became more than routine. It became a lifeline, for her and for me. I listened to stories of sleepless nights, aching bellies, and broken promises, and I shared my own cracks so they'd know they weren't alone. Each time a young girl looked up and said, "Thank you, Granny Ruth," I felt my faith in people stitch itself back together, thread by trembling thread. It wasn't a grand miracle, no thunderbolts or angel choirs, but a quiet awakening in my heart, proof that second chances can begin in the simplest acts. A swing on the porch, a cup of tea, a promise kept. That is how hope tiptoed back into my bones, through the eyes of a frightened child who reminded me of my own 14-year-old self. It taught me that when life strips you bare, you can still offer warmth, understanding, and a hand to hold. Sometimes, the smallest step, walking down a dusty road with biscuits in your basket, is exactly the new beginning you've been praying for. I remember the morning I stood in that empty parsonage living room, sunlight slanting through dusty lace curtains and painting golden stripes across the hardwood floor. In my hand was the tattered leather-bound journal I'd kept since I was 14, a diary of raw prayers, scrawled fears, and desperate pleas for refuge. I ran my thumb over the worn cover, recalling where my fingerprints had pressed into the leather all those years ago. For decades, this book had been both my confidant and my chain, reminding me of mistakes I thought I'd never outgrow. That day, I took a steadying breath as the scent of honeysuckle drifted in from the open window, and I opened the journal to its very first page, Mama's gentle handwriting spelling out my name, Sweet Ruth Ellen. I traced those letters and remembered her soft voice saying, "Child, you have a heart like a biscuit, breakable, warm, but made to nourish." In that moment, I knew the girl who believed in kindness and simple goodness was still inside me, waiting to be set free. With deliberate calm, I carried the journal to the little wrought iron table where I kept my scissors and old ribbons. Page by page, I cut them out and let them flutter to the floor like worn confessions set afloat on a breeze. Tears pricked my cheeks, not from sorrow, but from release. Every scrap I severed was a promise I freed, the promise that I would no longer be defined by my past pain. When the final scraps drifted down, I saw the raw wooden tabletop beneath, as though a fresh slate had been carved in my life. I gathered the faded ribbons Mama had sewn into the cracks of each page and knelt beside the hearth. I laid them on the coals one by one and watched them curl and blacken, smoke spiraling up toward the high, pale ceiling. The flames licked the leather binding, cracking it open, and in that moment I felt the bindings around my own heart crack too. The heat didn't burn me, it warmed me, as if the fire were a friend helping me shed an old skin. Rising, I brushed ash from my knees, walked to the front door, and stepped out into the bright morning light. Everything felt sharper, more alive. Every leaf, every bird call, every distant hum of a passing car seemed infused with possibility. I realized I had made a choice to honor my past without letting it imprison my future. In that clarity, I decided I would leave the parsonage behind, sell it, and use the proceeds to start a small ministry of my own, one built on compassion and true listening, not judgment or hidden chains. Weeks later, I packed the last of my belongings into my battered station wagon, Mama's quilt, my teacups, and the single photograph of me in that pale blue Easter dress, smiling beside Reverend Elroy. I slipped that photo into the glove compartment, behind a fresh stack of letters I'd written to women I'd met since, letters of encouragement, solidarity, and hope. I knew I could no longer walk in a shadow, but I could carry forward the lessons I'd learned about strength, resilience, and the right to choose my own path. As I drove down the dusty road toward town, a gentle lightness settled in my chest, as though a bird had nested there, cooing softly. I wasn't running from my past, I was honoring it by living beyond it. I understood that forgiveness isn't about excusing injustice, but about releasing its power to dictate your life. And with each mile beneath my wheels, I whispered aloud, I choose to live on without shame, without regret, simply onward. That choice changed everything. My voice, once hushed, grew firm and sweet like Mama's lullabies rising into the night. My hands, once trembling, learned to cradle hurt souls and hand them lanterns of their own making. And my heart, once broken, found its rhythm again, a steady, hopeful drumbeat carrying me into days of new beginnings. I became a woman not defined by the cage I escaped, but by the wings I dared to spread. In that freedom, I discovered the true miracle, a life proclaimed as a life reborn. You know, looking back from this porch in my 70s, I see two Ruths clearer than the finest stained glass, one who believed her worth was tied to obedience, silence, and the approval of a man cloaked in God's name, and the other who learned that true faith lives in the courage to speak her own heart. I once thought kindness meant surrendering my boundaries, that gratitude meant I owed my life to whoever offered me shelter, even if it came wrapped in chains. But now I understand that kindness begins with self-respect, setting your own heart's rhythm and refusing to march to someone else's drum. I used to wait for guidance from a voice outside myself, wait for approval from a congregation, wait for a savior to rescue me from loneliness. I spent years kneeling at pews, praying for a different life, only to discover that the sanctuary I longed for was not a building or a title, but the quiet space inside me where I could breathe without shame and choose without fear. The hardest truth I carry is this: mercy can be mistaken for entrapment. When someone tells you their hands are warm, look closely to see if they also hide iron. I learned that love demands honesty above all, that someone who uses God's name as a whip will never wield compassion as a guide. And yet, compassion is the vessel that carried me back to hope, for myself and for the frightened girls I sit with now. I learned that your greatest ministry might not be in pulpit sermons, but in plain words spoken over chamomile tea, in hands held against the tremble of grief, in teaching a young stranger that her voice matters more than any promise of safety offered by a stranger's shadow. I've come to see that forgiveness is not forgetting. It's the act of setting down a burden so you can lift someone else's. I don't excuse what was done to me, but I refuse to carry its weight any longer. Every time I walk away from the parsonage that once caged me, every letter I write to a girl in crisis, every rose I tend in Mama's garden, I reclaim a piece of myself that once lay buried in shame. I choose to nourish that part, the part that believes we are all worthy of joy, deserving of agency, capable of rebuilding our lives from the ashes of what broke us. If there's a single thread I want to weave through your own story, it's this. Waiting for the world to change before you change your mind about yourself is like waiting for a spring frost to melt before planting seeds. You must plant, water, and trust in growth, even when the ground feels frozen. You must speak your truth, even when your voice shakes. You must choose your own path, even when every signpost tells you otherwise. The life you inherit is not the life you have to live. You have the right to feel safe in your own skin, to demand respect, to walk away from any mercy that silences your heart. So maybe it's time you stopped waiting for someone to rescue you and started rescuing yourself. Maybe it's time you set down the burdens you never asked for and picked up the gentle courage that's been hiding in your own soul. Remember, kindness begins with self-respect, and the truest sanctuary is the one you build inside your own heart. Well now, my dear friend, here we find ourselves at the end of this long journey together, just you, me, and the soft glow of evening settling over the porch. I hope, as you've listened to my story, you felt the warmth of these old timbers and the comfort of a quiet rocking chair beneath you. This tale isn't just about what happened so many years ago, it lives in my heart today. Every time I walk past Mama's roses or sit with a young girl who needs to know she's seen and safe, I carry the echoes of those days, the joy and the sorrow, like a gentle hymn that never leaves my lips, reminding me that life's sweetest moments often grow from the soil of our deepest pains. As the cicadas settle into their nighttime song and the stars tremble awake overhead, I find myself wondering, what about you? When you think of love, kindness, and the promises we're taught to cherish, do you believe true love always finds its way back to us? Or does it slip through our fingers like water gone too swift, leaving only the memory of its touch? In the hush before dawn, I sometimes imagine Reverend Elroy gazing out over those fields, his grief as real as mine, and I think, maybe he remembers the girl he named his wife, the one who wasn't his to keep. It's a tender question I tuck close to my heart, neither fully sorrowful nor entirely hopeful. Life isn't wrapped in neat bows or tied with silver threads. It's ragged and beautiful, messy and sublime. I share my story not to fill you with sorrow, but to remind you that your own history, however tangled, holds lessons waiting to be unearthed. Perhaps you've carried kindness too far, or lingered in a place that stole your joy. Maybe you've waited for a love you never asked for, or for a version of yourself that felt safe but wasn't real. If my journey shows you anything, let it be this: you have the right to choose your own path, to set down burdens you never borrowed, and to cultivate a garden of hope in the soil of your own becoming. So, as we part ways on this warm summer night, I leave you with this question echoing in your heart: do you believe real love must always return? Will you listen for its footsteps in the corridors of your own life, or will you plant new seeds of love where you stand, trusting that growth often springs from the smallest acts of courage? Sometimes I hear a soft hymn drifting on the breeze. Perhaps it's the memory of Sunday services, or my own voice lifted in gratitude. And sometimes I feel certain that he still remembers. Thank you, dear one, for sharing this hour with me. May your own story find its wings, and may you carry forward the wisdom that true love, like hope, endures even when the world seems silent. If you ever feel that gentle tug at your heart, know that you're not alone. You are seen, you are cherished, and your own chapters are waiting to be written with courage, kindness, and an open heart.